Welcome to the Inner Edge. I'm your host, Nick Edgar. I'm a men's self-leadership coach, and I'm really excited to be putting this out there. And I want to send you some heartfelt gratitude that you've chosen to spend the next anywhere between about 60 and 90 minutes together. Whilst you're welcome just to sit back and watch and take it all in, there's also an opportunity to do some personal work on your own while you're following along. So I'd really encourage you to do that. But without further ado, let's just get into it. So I would describe myself as a highly sensitive, empathetic, gifted, and passionate man in his 50s. It's probably taken me most of my life to even be able to say that without wanting to vomit down myself. There was a time for 2 decades where I would never even want anyone to know any of these traits about me, but I now wear them proudly on my sleeve and in my heart. For the past 5 years, I've worked full time as a men's self leadership coach. And what I do is I help men look at who they really are, the conditioned behaviors that are driving the bus in their lives, and some of which they might have written off as this is just who I am. But they're the behaviors that are keeping them stuck, that are stopping them from showing up in the world, having the relationships and building the life that somewhere inside them, alongside of that, they know they have the potential to live. As well as extensive lived experience, which I'm going to take you through in just a moment. I'm also qualified in counselling skills. I spent time at the Sherwood Psychotherapy Institute in Nottingham before moving over to qualifying in transformational life coaching, neurolinguistic programming, and clinical hypnotherapy. And I've also completed CPD courses in breathwork, IFS parts work, tapping, nervous regulation tools. Now, I say that just to give you a baseline of who I am coming in here. As I said, I'm going to take you a bit more into my story and how I've ended up here and why I'm so passionate about being a men's coach. But first of all, I want to allow you to have a first opportunity to just explore why you're here. So if you look at the bottom in the middle, I'm literally asking that direct question. Why are you here? So as I'm talking through this slide and throughout, just keep an eye on these prompts because it will allow you to just take a bit of a deep dive and start doing some personal work. So who are you and why are you here? I think it's important to note that none of us are completely alike as men. And I think we all have a unique story, which is completely valid, whatever that is. And I think that if we are going to even try and understand who we are as men, we have to look at not just ourselves and men as a whole and masculinity, but we have to look at it through an intersectional lens. And what I mean by that is that it's looking at the fact that all of us come from different cultural backgrounds, different economic privileges, different parts of the country. There are all sorts of reasons why we are who we are, and that's very different and unique, and that brings different and unique challenges. However, for the purpose of this masterclass, what I'm really focusing on is what I call our shared terrain. Those are the things as men that generally speaking we have in common. Okay. So for me, a big part of that, especially in Western culture, is it's a patriarchal conditioning. The 95%, up to 95% of how we think, feel, and behave as adults are conditioned patterns playing out over and over and over again. And they can feel permanent. And we can often think, this is just the way I am as a man. So, for example, if you're a driver and someone cuts you up and you immediately react and you shout at them or give them the finger or whatever it is, you might just think they deserved it. You might think that's just the way I am. God, I wish I could be a bit calmer, not matter so much. This is potentially part of the conditioning I'm talking about. It shows up in so many different ways in so many parts of our lives. So I want you to get curious about that throughout this masterclass. And there's two quotes I want to draw your attention to. The first is by Bell Hooks, who's a famous writer about patriarchy, how it harms men, how it harms women, how it is systemic at all sorts of different levels in the world that most of us have brought up in and certainly most of us are living in. And she says the first act of violence is that patriarchy demands of males is to kill off the emotional parts of themselves. Just sit with that for a moment. the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is to kill off the emotional parts of themselves. Let's break that down. What does that mean? Let's think of a really common saying that we say to small boys. Big boys don't cry. What are we really doing to a small child when we say that to them? When they're in an emotional state, when they're upset by something, when they're trying to express themselves and don't have the language to do that. So it all pours out in emotions. We encourage them to shut it down. We say, if you're going to be the kind of boy I want you to be, this isn't appropriate behavior. That's what I mean. That's a really simple example of what I mean by killing off the emotional parts of ourselves. But then the artist Grayson Perry describes that by the time we become men, masculinity becomes this kind of suit of armor that we've been welded inside, where we can't take it off, even if it's suffocating him. And I think that's such a profound statement and speaks to what I was talking about when we think that this is just part of my personality. And I want to be really curious about that and question it, because I know from my own lived experience and my own journey that that isn't true. We become the subsection of all of our experiences, our environments, as well as who we might naturally be. So therefore, the question to ask at this stage is, how do we begin to take that armor off? How do we reconnect to the emotional parts of ourselves? And that's a big part of what we're going to explore throughout the rest of this masterclass. But if you haven't already done so, just take a moment now and just ask yourself, why are you here? And maybe the answer to that is, I don't know, and that's okay. And at any point, if you are journaling and I move on to another slide or another topic, just encourage you to press pause. Really take your time with this, and you can obviously come back to it anytime you like. So I want to talk now about a bit of my own story of growing up. So I'm in my 50s now. I was born in 1974, and I describe my parents as overall very loving, doing the best they can to give the best life to me and my siblings. But ultimately, there are two traits that really affected me. One is an emotionally immature father. And by that, what I mean is a father that was quick to temper, couldn't really express his emotions or be with his emotions. And my mum made excuses for him, was very quiet and people-pleasing in the background to try and maintain peace within the family. As I said, I've got a lot of love for them. They did the best they could. But I think it's okay that as people, none of us are perfect. As parents, none of us are perfect. As kids, none of us are perfect. But it had a big impact on me. Secondly, the Catholic faith as I experienced it. For me, a lot of that was about, if I am a good boy, I will go to heaven. And being a good boy, I wasn't always clear about what that was. So sometimes I thought I was being a perfectly good boy, but I would find out I wasn't. And then thirdly, the world of men in professional football. So growing up in these environments, I would describe myself as a young child on the left in that picture as sensitive and gifted, bright, interested, curious, creative, just doing whatever I felt came naturally. Very caring, but also very confident. And as I went through puberty, I became much more unpredictable and changeable, inconsistent and introverted, sometimes confident, sometimes very afraid and anxious, and carrying a lot of shame, which I didn't recognize then, but I do now. And that picture in the middle is the footballer, which was, I always got praise for being a footballer and being a good footballer. By that stage, I was playing for Tottenham Hotspur. But on the right-hand side of that middle picture, I'm also singing the lead of Joseph in our school play and got absolutely ripped to shreds for it. So much so that I nearly pulled out at the last minute because I just wanted the ribbing and the Mickey taking to stop. So this kind of incongruence and the messaging I'm getting about, okay, if I do this, I'm a good boy. If I do this, I can be praised by my peers and be a leader. If I do this, well, that's not what being a boy is. So therefore, I'm not going to do that anymore. And I did. I abandoned big parts of myself as early as being a primary school child through puberty. By the time I became an adolescent and football was becoming a serious career opportunity for me, I signed up for Watford at 14. I was released by them at 16, then joined Reading. You can read all about that, by the way, in a series of articles I've written on Substack, which I'll put in the notes. And I don't want to dwell too much on that now, other than to say that in the world of professional football, as I experienced it, men were very old school. They were very authoritarian, very black and white about who I needed to be to not just survive in that environment, but to have a chance of thriving in it. So what I really did throughout those years, throughout those teenage years, was just abandon anything that didn't fit that. That started in puberty and it definitely carried on throughout my journey in professional football. So by the time I became 16, 17, and 18, and I'm doing it full time, I am masked and I am vigilant. Like no one is seeing who I am really. I'm closed, but I'm cynical as well. I'm starting to ask questions about what the fuck is going on here. And I'm starting to numb out emotions. Part of that had already started through alcohol, smoking, things like that, binge eating, all sorts of ways. So as football didn't work out for me, I stepped away from it just before my 20th birthday. I was lucky enough to have got my A levels, which meant that I was able to go to university, and I decided to explore theology to try and understand who I was, to understand more about my background. But at university, all of that conditioning had already begun to take hold. So I was presenting a certain version of myself, like continuing being really masked, really cynical, no one really seeing who I was. And you can see from that photo on the left, like I'm outwardly outgoing, extroverted, a right lad, hedonistic, I'm promiscuous, all of these things to try and curry favor from my peers. Very undisciplined. Like I ended up getting a third in my degree because I barely showed up for it. And there was arrogance to me, but it was false arrogance. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't genuine self-worth. I was absolutely terrified inside and I didn't want anyone to see it. After I graduated, I fell into the world of travel. I spent a brief time working in Italy as a teacher. But by then I was smoking weed every day. Like I couldn't sit with the pain of football not working out, of issues from my upbringing. And I met a woman who asked me to marry her after only knowing each other for a few weeks. And I said yes. And we eloped. I didn't want to tell anyone. She made sure that no one knew and cheated on me within a few weeks. But again, thinking about how conditioning plays out, because of my religious upbringing, I genuinely felt that even though my journey into marriage was unusual, for me, I genuinely, it was for life, for better or worse. And it was definitely worse. She cheated on me within a few weeks. That descended into coercive control and ultimately sometimes violence on her part if we were in disagreement and argument. But through that, I became a homeowner while all of that was going on. I was building a career in the travel industry, living in London. So outwardly, everything looked amazing, really. People were like, wow, you're doing great. You've got this career, you've got your own home, you're married. Like, well done for like sorting yourself out. But inside, I was lonely. No one knew me. I was wearing multiple masks. By then, I turned into what I would describe as a full-blown people pleaser. Whatever room I was in, that was the version of me that I became. My natural traits of compassion, empathy, connection were all used purely for that purpose because I only felt safe when I was being needed, when I was being what I thought people needed me to be at work, with my friends. Like all of it was all false. But the emotional weight I was carrying inside just began to get too much. So the weed just became daily. I was stoned all the time because it was the only way I could find balance to keep going. So inside, as I said, the levels of anxiety and depression were so much that when I wasn't stoned, which was very rare, it was a nightmare. Ultimately, I had a breakdown. After my wife left, after a couple of years, I was left on my own, struggling, and I just slowly fell apart. Again, outwardly trying to keep it together, but I lost my job and decided that I couldn't handle being in London, being in the world anymore. 9/11 happened and loads of people got made redundant at work. And it was just it was overwhelming is the word that I would describe. Everything that had happened to me up to that point got the better of me. And at 26, 27, I just checked out. I lost my job. I sold the house. I went into the bank and it was as close to psychosis as I've ever been. I took all my money out in cash and I ran back to my family home. It was the only place at that time that I felt safe. But what that gave me was space. It gave me an opportunity while I was still getting stoned and dealing as best as I could with my emotional pain. I eventually made the decision to go to therapy. And that was really life changing for me because at 27, eventually, it took a few weeks, I started to speak my truth for the first time. In very haphazard ways, emotions started to come to the surface for the first time. I was witnessed in that for the first time, and that was really powerful for me. And I started to realize and question for the first time that I actually have some choices about who I want to be in the world. Part of that process for me was learning to develop self-awareness and to begin to express myself as a man and as a person. So part of that was journaling. Part of that then became creative, and I started to write songs and I started to go on stage and express that. And that led me to moving to East Midlands and actually being in a band for 5 years. Now, while parts of the new me, as I was leaving my 20s and getting into my 30s, felt exactly that, felt like I was growing and evolving, some of the old patterns just kept coming back. I was still being who people needed me to be, even though there were some elements of authenticity to who I was and how I was trying to be in the world. It was too easy for me to self-abandon because that conditioning was there. So therapy had given me an outlet to express myself and help me to feel safe, but I didn't have the skills. So what that meant was by the time I got into my 30s, all of the shoulds started coming in. I should be having a proper job. I should be owning my own house again. I should be finding a partner and settling down. So I settled for normal again. I went back into corporate work, working in the engineering industry, within business administration, managerial roles. I became a homeowner again, just before the financial crash. And unfortunately, another relationship didn't work out, which meant I was stuck on an interest-only mortgage in a house that was worth two-thirds of what it was when I bought it. I was having to pay for that alone because I was single. And again, slowly, I just started to unravel, fall apart. And this time it was worse than it had been in my 20s. I started experiencing suicidal ideation. And I think really started to live in a victim mindset that the whole world is against me. I couldn't see a way out. It was so dark. Um, but ultimately, I was able to get out of that. And I'm so grateful to the version of me that I was then that had eventually drew upon that previous therapeutic experience to climb out of it really slowly. The role that I was in was made redundant. I had a long time off sick. They probably wanted to get rid of me, and I can't blame them for that. But I used that money to reinvest in myself again with more therapy of different kinds, starting to explore things more holistically, looking at my nervous system, looking at trauma and how that lives in the body. And as I turned 40, I really started to make a commitment to my long-term healing, to growth, to living my potential my way, and really trying to shed any of that conditioning that I was taking as a given that this is just who I am. I started to really explore that and commit to it. And that's a journey I'm still on today. So while it's been a long journey full of ups and downs, and this is just a very quick synopsis of that, I do believe now that I am the happiest that I've ever been as a man. And for me, it started quite late. I describe myself as a late bloomer, which is why, whatever age you are watching this, I can't stress enough that change is always possible, even if you firmly believe with everything you know yourself to be that it isn't. So let's just take a breath. Thank you for listening to that. I appreciate it. I just want it to give some context to why I'm here doing this, why I've got so much passion to help other men, hopefully never have to have the desperate experiences I have, but also to not settle for a life that's less than what they desire and what they deserve, simply because of how they've been conditioned and what they've come to believe about themselves and the world around them. So if you haven't done already, I really do just want you to make some notes of, well, what's coming up for you? How do you understand your own story as a man up to this point? And maybe start to think as well about, well, what do I believe is possible for me? Are there parts of me that feel stuck? Are there parts of me that don't believe that there's more out there for me? But then maybe you also have another part of yourself that goes, no, I know that I'm capable of so much more than who I am right now. It's so much more common than you might believe. Certainly my 5 years doing this work as well as my own lived experience tells me that. So we're going to start to dive into the topic of masculinity a bit more broadly now. So building on what you've already thought about and noted about yourself, I want to look at a masculinity spectrum. I want to be really keen here as well that this isn't trying to define what masculinity is. There's a lot of talk seemingly really trying to define what masculinity is in the modern world. Is it this? Is it that? We've obviously got toxic examples of that, which we'll get onto shortly. But for me, there is no such thing as a specific definition of what masculinity is, which is why I like to talk about masculinities. But I think for me, what I want to touch upon here is that, broadly speaking, there are what I would call a set of more traditional traits that are associated with masculinity and more modern traits. That's the way I like to frame it. But wherever you naturally sit, and I'd encourage you to start to look at some of these words and think, what feels true for me as a man? Where do I more naturally sit? What are some of these traits that feel true for me, and what doesn't? Because these traits will form your values, and your values will form your needs, and your needs will form your behaviors. But very often, our values are part of this conditioning. They're arrived at by your family, your religion, if you have one, by the school you attended and the teachers you encountered, by your communities, your sports teams, your town, your county, all of it matters. It's all part of it. So I think if we're looking at authenticity and being able to shed that conditioning, we have to start to get curious about what's true for you. Not what is the right answer, but what's true for you. And what I've come to learn about myself is that I'm a mixture of all of this. Naturally and proudly now. When you really lean into what feels natural for you, you may well sit more towards the traditional side, and that's fine. You might sit more towards the modern, and that's fine. There may be traits that aren't on here, and that's okay too. But really tune into not just what your mind is telling you, but what's your body saying. When you look at some of these traits, does something happen in your body? Because that's part of what we're going to start to explore, how your body as well as your mind can be such a great guide for you as a man if you learn how to tune into its signals and its messages. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but I think there's so much talk about toxic masculinity in the modern world that I don't think I could do a men's masterclass without at least touching on it. So I think we see a lot of toxic masculinity more commonly phrased now as the manosphere. And it tends to have very rigid ideas, tends to be rooted more in those traditional traits, but it takes it to such extremes that, those traits of dominance, control, emotional suppression, that it's harmful. It's not just harmful to boys, but especially to everyone around them, and especially women and girls. But I think I can't stress enough that tuning into this theme of masculinities, that none of the traits in themselves are good or bad. It's how they're used. So I believe that when masculinity of any kind is rooted in integrity and empathy, it is a powerful force for good. It only becomes harmful when it's twisted into manipulation or coercive control of some kind, and toxic when it is designed to control others, abuse others, cause harm to others for personal gain in some way. So, therefore, both traditional and modern traits can be both beautiful and toxic and everything in between. I think it's really important because it tends to just focus on the traditional end. So, yes, those traditional ends, like if the manipulation is aggression, emotional suppression, some of that can be wrapped up as banter. I hate that word. Um, but it's toxic when it turns into fear and shame or masked dominance used to control or harm others. That's what most of us tend to think about, and what most of the talk is around toxic masculinity. But I think also these modern traits can also become harmful when they're used to manipulate through niceness or emotional performance. So not authentic empathy, but manipulative, masked empathy. It's there is a Machiavellian reason why I am performing these traits. And it becomes toxic when you become that performative good guy. And there are plenty of men out there doing that as well. And I identify with some of those harmful and toxic traits from both ends. Here's a real tough question to ask. What are your harmful and toxic needs and behaviors? It's a really deep question to ask. And parts of you will probably come up and go, that's not me. We see so much of this online. When we hear the phrase, not all men, for example, it's you see so many men in the comments going, that's not me, nothing to do with me. We have to take collective responsibility as men. And that's what I want to touch on next. Because sometimes it's not about what I do, but it's about what I tolerate, what I allow around me without stepping in. And even if I don't agree with it, if I stay quiet, that's problematic. Now, there is a reality that we all have to accept, and that is that VOG, or violence against women and girls, is shockingly common. It's almost certainly on the increase, and it isn't caused by one type of man or one type of masculinity, as I've already touched upon. I'm really passionate about framing it in that way. So I think that for me, if you're a man looking to embrace personal growth, to evolve, to become a better man, whatever's driving that, I think we have to take an empathetic view that certainly as far as the women in our lives are concerned, to greater or lesser degrees, we are part of the problem unless we're actively part of the solution. And that might be a hard truth to digest. But I think that even if you may not be exhibiting any problematic behaviors and your attitudes you consider to not be problematic, if you stay unaware of this issue, if you are uninterested, it might be going on around you, in your own family, at work, in one of your friends, someone in your sports team, and you're ignoring it. I'm afraid that is being complicit. It might be complicit in a different way, but nevertheless, it's complicit. And I think the sooner all men can just recognize that without shame, without making it mean anything about them as an individual, listening to women's stories with empathy and curiosity and displaying active listening, really listening to their story and believing it as it is presented, the better off we're all going to be, and the more we can move forward together. And that's really what I'm interested in. So that last sentence of silence is a mask, I really want you to let that sink in. And I want you to be really real with yourself for a moment and say, what are the behaviors that I tolerate, that I see around me? Maybe it's a bit of sexism in your WhatsApp group. Maybe it's the mate that everybody has that's cheating on his girlfriend, and you just allow it, and you might know about it, but they don't. It's all these sorts of things which we have to be real with ourselves, I believe. Otherwise, all we're doing is turning a blind eye to some very, very real problems and just focusing on the stuff we want to focus on. But I think if we're really going to step into who we're here to be, we have to get in the trenches with this stuff. That's why it's in this masterclass. So let's take a moment and look at what we might think of as traditional men's work. This is just, again, I think it's a really useful and simple way to frame this, where you've got crisis at one end and wellness at the other. And what I mean by that is the things at the bottom, men tend to go to when they are either in or they're coming through a crisis, whereas maybe when they are looking to improve themselves, maybe when they're already in a decent place, they might embrace some of these other things first of all. It doesn't have to work like that, but I think it's useful to think of it. And while I'm just going through these, just think about, well, what have you explored personally? What do you do regularly? Like, just start to build up a bit of a personal library of yeah, I've explored this. I've never tried that. Can be really useful. So at the top end, I think one of the most common things, and social media is awash with it, especially for men. Fitness, strength training, men. Often this kind of training, this kind of coaching doubles down on some of those traditional values, potentially harmful and toxic values. You need discipline. You need to build resilience. You need to be a fortress, and you build confidence through physical training and nutrition and all of that stuff. For me, being physically fit and physically strong is neither here nor there. It's not good or bad. You may be called to it, you may not, but it's not going to give you everything. And the reason I know that is that many of my clients have been down that road thinking it's going to make them feel more confident, thinking it's going to make them a better father and a better partner or a better friend or improve their financial status. And that might do that. There might be men for whom that's true. But a lot of the clients I work with, it just hasn't given them that. At the other end, we've got therapy and recovery, and I've spoken about that in the context of my own story. Um, that tends to be very focused around processing what's happened to you to gain a greater understanding and acceptance, possibly forgiveness, though I don't think that's necessary. But it allows you to grow in a way by letting go of some of the weight of what you're carrying with you. And I like that, but I don't think we have to be in crisis to benefit from it either. But there is stigma around men going to therapy in a way there just isn't about going to a gym or taking on a personal trainer. Um, and then in the middle, we've got some other common things like going to men's retreats or taking on a personal challenge, raising money for charity, that kind of thing. Very outcome focused challenge. Purpose and mindset coaching. A lot of that in the men's space tends to be around Jungian archetypes. What I mean by that is Carl Jung, a very prominent psychologist. I'm not going to get too deeply into that now, but there are various archetypes like the king and the magician and the warrior, and the lover. And it gives you a framework within which to understand sort of some of your better behaviors and how that when these parts of you and these archetypes are working against you and are harmful, it can be useful, but for me, I think it can be a bit more, it can almost try and force you into a framework that may not fit you. So it has its benefits, but I think it also has its drawbacks. And then men's circles, talking groups, walking groups, the phrase it's good to talk, I think that's very common. And I do think there's a lot of value in that. Going back to my own story, that time in therapy, just being able to be witnessed in my truth, there's an awful lot of power in that. But it also didn't upskill me to become a better man, live a better life, live a more satisfied and purpose-driven life. So if you haven't already done so, just take a moment and make a note of what you've explored. Now, this next slide for me is, well, what's often missing? You know, when I think about my own journey in and out of therapy, the good times, the bad times, I didn't really encounter much of this stuff. And certainly looking at the previous slide, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to this stuff. So for me, I think that everything has value. Um, but if we only focus on mindset and behaviors, which a lot of men's work does, we're missing some deeper inner layers, which is often why when we then come out of those experiences, we go back to who we've always been. that conditioning kicks in, and over time, anything new that we learn or any behaviors that we try to improve our lives fall by the wayside. The most common example of that is a New Year's resolution. Willpower alone and learning alone can't take us to where we really want to be in a sustainable way, I believe. So I think four of the key things that are often missing is working with your nervous system. And I would definitely like to get across the idea that very often it's our nervous system and our body that is the real decision maker, not necessarily our logical mind, even though we often think it's the thought that drives the feeling and the behavior. And I think that can be true. Very often, I think when we think of reactive behaviors or behaviors that seem to be driven by something other than conscious choice, that's our nervous system at work. And we can work with that, but we have to learn how. And that's a very different kind of personal development work. Then emotions, very common one for men. We have to learn to feel our emotions. We have to develop our emotional landscape. If we think about our emotions, even just our vocabulary around emotions, just thinking of this right now in the moment, how many emotions can you actually name right now? Take a moment, write them down. And I think one of the best tools that you can get for yourself is an emotions wheel, which shows you, I don't know, 100, 200 emotions that sit under core emotions that you are familiar with, like anger and fear and sadness. But developing not just the vocabulary and the awareness, but learning how that our emotions are actually messengers that show up in our body, and they're not problems to fix or certainly not to suppress. But very often, most men that I come across have this: an emotion comes up and the conditioning pushes it back down again. We're taught to live in our heads. Now, parts or masks, I'm going to get onto that in a bit more detail, along with these other themes in a moment. But what I like to describe these as these are the strategies of the conditioning that, even if we don't realize that's what they're doing, they're here to keep us safe by never experiencing anything new. That's how I would phrase it. And because they don't want us to experience anything new, we often stay stuck thinking, feeling, and behaving like we've always behaved. And lastly, what does that all mean when we tie it together and really look at the detail of our conditioning? Well, these are the beliefs, these are the rules that we've created for ourselves or that have been created for us. And we obey them. But do we ever question them? Do we ever think, are there different and better ways that I can choose, that I can learn to follow? We're going to explore all of that now. But have you come across any of these now? And if so, how? Have you paid attention to them before? So thinking about our nervous system, and I've got like a traffic light on the left-hand side, and I want to think about briefly just looking at our nervous system and in the context of that. When we're green, we are feeling ourselves. Stress feels appropriate to where we are, but we don't feel stressed. So we are just breathing. We are going about our business. We feel, all things being equal, ourselves. Yellow is when we consciously feel stress. And stress shows up in many different ways, and not all of it is bad. But again, we tend to think of stress as overload. Something's happening in our life that's too much, or it's happening repetitively, which means that it's causing us a problem. Now, that can be true, of course, but it's not always true. And then red, I want to think of in the context of we're either really overwhelmed, really angry, finding it really difficult to feel ourselves, or maybe we're completely shut down and we're withdrawing. So ask yourself, where do you commonly sit? And does that change if you're with different people in a different situation? Like a really common example might be, yeah, I often feel really stressed, really overwhelmed, overloaded at work, but actually at home, I can feel pretty calm and I can feel myself. That's probably the most common for men. But the big part of this slide for me is that when we think about stress, as I've already touched upon, we think about it as bad or as a problem we need to fix, that when we're in stress, we have to come back to calm. But whenever we try something new, we're going to feel a certain kind of stress. And that stress is called eustress. It's positive stress. And it's incredibly important for any kind of personal growth. For me, it's like the border of what we know to be true, our lived experience, and what our nervous system is set up to tolerate. But then you have this kind of border where we start to feel eustress, and that can feel like excitement, but then it can start to feel like fear as well, because fear and excitement show up in the body in very similar ways. So often what we do is we start to do something new or we start to change positively for ourselves, but then we interpret it as maybe some of the stress that is genuinely problematic. And therefore we stop doing the thing because of the fear and we start to regulate that fear. And we often hear so much at the moment about nervous system regulation, and that is presented as we need to be calm and zen, and it's about relaxation and mindfulness and bringing us back to a place of just almost sedateness. But that's problematic. Not enough people talk about that. So, I'm a coach. I want people to move forward. I want people to have new experiences because it's only by building new experiences do we create a new normal and expand our nervous system. So I think if there's one thing you can take out of this masterclass, it's that, excitement and fear feel very similar. Nervous system regulation is about appropriateness, not about always being calm. And I think in addition to that, when we think about it from a neuroplasticity point of view, for most people, right up until the moment we die, we are capable of change. But another trap we can fall into is that we think something outside of us has to change in order for us to be able to step into it. Oh, I'm going to feel much happier when X, Y, Z happens. I'm going to be able to live the life I want to do when I'm retired in 10 years' time. Like, that might be true for you, but it also means that you're telling yourself you can't do anything for the next 10 years other than hold on and white knuckle your way through what's going on. And look, I'm not saying that change is easy. It's not. It's very, very difficult and challenging, but it's also not as challenging as you might think. And the more you do it, the more you recognize that. And the more you also begin to understand your nervous system and realize that when you're doing something new, you're going to feel that stress and you don't want to sedate it or calm it. You want to learn to walk with it. A good example of that is me doing this masterclass right now. I'm not sat here relaxed. Like beforehand, I felt like that football pre-match nerves. And, as I'm speaking to you now, I know that there are probably things that I'm missing out. And, there's a part of me that wants to make sure this is the best possible value for you sat here in front of me now. Like all of that makes me feel eustress. But if I turn away from it, and I think, oh my God, this is something that's a warning. This is a problem that I need to solve. I'm never going to be here sat in front of you doing this. And for a long time in my life, that's why I white knuckled and struggled, because it was misinterpreting the signals of my nervous system. So I think for me, it's not just about understanding our nervous system in the now and why we've become the man we've become. It's also about actively taking steps to move into a new normal and doing that in small steps, but regularly. And then noticing along the way when you look back and think, oh my God, I didn't see that change happen, but I really can tell the difference. That's a big part of the work I do with my clients and the work I continue to do myself. Our emotions. So again, I think I've already asked this question, but in a different way. But how deep is your emotional self-awareness, I think for me, emotions are not good or bad. They're just energy in motion. We're meant to experience them, feel them and process them in a healthy way, and then let go of them. That's it. If we allow ourselves to do that, the whole thing takes about 90 seconds. But very often, what we're conditioned to do, especially as men, is we start to feel the emotion and then we push it down. Now, there are certain circumstances where it's appropriate to not feel our emotions in the moment, like a toddler does. Like if we were all doing that all of the time, it would be chaos. So I think the point is here is to understand where we are safe to fully feel and express ourselves healthily in the moment. And when we recognize we can't do that, but nevertheless we need to come back to it and find a way to process it and release it. So that might be, well, I'm a manager of people at work. I don't want to get too emotional in front of them in the moment. I want to maintain my professional stance, but yet I don't want to carry that with me and keep that inside my body. What I want to do is let that out in some way, but in a healthy way. So I'm going to play football later and I'm going to play it competitively. Don't confuse that with I'm then going to play football and I'm going to be an asshole. That's very different. Okay. So I think for me, it starts by increasing our vocabulary and understanding how different emotions show up in different ways, very subtly, but they might show up in different parts of your body. They might show up in ways that you can start to recognize and differentiate between this is making me angry and this is making me frustrated. And even as I say those two emotions right now, how do you differentiate between the two of them? And I think for me, anger tends to show up in my body where my face gets flushed. I can feel my head and I can feel myself wanting to go into a physical reaction. Whereas frustration for me is more about I need a release. I need to scream or shout or just relieve the tension. So learning how to process these things in a way which is healthy, that doesn't adversely affect you or those around you, that's what we're really looking at here. Now, the parts or masks, if that hasn't made any sense to you right now, I hope it starts to now with this brief list, especially in relation to what I call self-abandonment, which is right now you might be fairly calm and chilled and taking all of this in, but in those moments of stress, another part of you steps in. And these are some really common ones. So, for example, I touched on this earlier. You might have an intellectualizer or a philosopher part that always wants to stay in the mind, analyzing everything and doesn't want to feel it. It always wants to make sense of the feeling instead of actually feeling the feeling. You might have a high achiever or perfectionist part where you only ever feel worthy if you are doing personal bests or you're getting the next promotion or the next course ticked off. And very often that part is there to prevent you from ever feeling failure or mediocre or normal. I'm not going to go down the whole list, but if you need to, take a moment to pause and just note, can you identify any of your parts here? Because whenever these parts come into the driving seat of our lives, that is part of our conditioning. They are trying to keep us doing what we've always done, is the best way I can describe it. So if you want to become someone new, if you want to be able to tap into more of your potential, if you want to expand your nervous system and flow with your emotions more, you've got to become aware of your parts, your masks, and how they show up for you. And sometimes these masks also show up only with certain people or in certain situations. And that's really important to remember as well. And again, I'm constantly discovering new parts of me. So this isn't about getting it right or getting a definitive list straight away, but it's thinking about, yeah, okay, I recognize I've got a helper or fixer in me. And while I like that part of me and I like helping other people, I often find myself overwhelmed at work and too many things to do because I've said yes to so many people. So it's things like that. When are these parts helping us and when are they unhelpful, not just to us, but to those around us? That's where we start to get into some of the really, really deep work because the sum of all of this is really then being able to put language to what we mean when we think about our conditioning. And a word I want to introduce here is our scripts. Like, what are our scripts? What are the conditioning for you that's playing out over and over again? And bringing it right back to the beginning, this patriarchal conditioning that most of us as men have in common, that some of these traditional traits are more generally acceptable maybe than some of the more modern traits, or maybe it's more specific than that for you. But ultimately, the strategies that we create are our conditioning, which form our scripts. And the more you can really get to understand your script via your masks, via your emotional awareness, via getting to know and understand your nervous system, the more you give yourself a roadmap and an opportunity to change because you have specifics that you can then focus on. So, for example, this is very much my script from the past that sometimes I'm still having to work on in the present to ensure that the future is much continually more of an authentic version of me, showing up for myself, for those I love, and in professional capacity. So for me, my script for a long time was don't be too much. Your depth, emotions, and intelligence overwhelm people, especially other men. Keep your ideas to yourself so you never get rejected. Stay safe by staying small. Don't take up space and don't outshine others and don't rock the boat. Be agreeable, helpful, and invisible so people will like you. And avoid conflict, avoid failure, and avoid being judged. Sacrifice your truth to keep others comfortable because staying safe through belonging, having mates, having a girlfriend, staying in good relations with my family, at work, it's more important than ever fully becoming yourself. That, for me, that last line was my truth and my conditioning. That staying safe as a man became more important to me in all areas of my life, never experiencing anything new, playing it safe, all of that, and therefore having belonging, having people with me, having connection, being in relationship with others, whoever I was in relationship with them was more important than ever becoming fully myself. But the bit that isn't written there, I touched on at the very beginning with my personal story, is that alongside all of that, those are the behaviors, that's the conditioning, that's the life I'm building and living for myself. But inside it is, this doesn't feel right, this doesn't feel good, this doesn't feel authentic. These constant voices, these constant feelings of unease that I was numbing out from are precisely because it wasn't authentic and it wasn't natural. If you want to be really courageous, pause here and actually begin to write your script out. Really face your own truth of who you are as a man right now. Developing self-awareness about all of these things and so much more is the first step towards being able to change. We often think that if I learn something new, I will become better. I can plaster some new learning, a better way of being, a new habit on top of everything that I am now. And then everything's going to move towards that better, shinier version of myself. It just doesn't work that way, at least not in my experience and not in the experience of my clients. And this is why learning is not enough to change. I do think, and this may be true for you, and if it is, I'm right there with you. I think a lot of men are drowning in knowledge. They're drowning in insight. They've learned, they've read a lot of self-help books. They understand a lot about who they are, but yet nothing is changing. And I think the simple reason for that is that understanding only lives in the mind. Knowledge only lives in the mind. I think there are a lot of great facilitators out there, potentially a lot of great therapists, a lot of great coaches, a lot of great practitioners that are so focused on what they can do for others that they haven't done enough for themselves. So actually nothing changes for themselves. And that's why often we see what I call the shadow sides. That is a Jungian phrase. But these parts coming in secretly behind the scenes, the secret habits no one knows about, things like that. Because it's only in the mind, so they can project outwards, but who are they like inwards? And I really like this sequence here. Understanding lives in the mind. Change lives in your nervous system. Your nervous system doesn't listen to these ideas, but it does listen to what you do again and again. And that's why action is so king. Action will build confidence. Action will build your authenticity, and action will define who you actually are, not who you say you are. And that's the most important thing. And to give you an example of this, I want you to just take a moment and I want you to think about, where have you understood something for years? It might be a behavior, a habit, something that you've learned and believed to be true. But when you think about the actions that you take in your life, it's as if you didn't know that or you didn't believe that. So where do you struggle to act? And that's really important because it's also a specific opportunity for you to create change right now. Now, I want to bring it back to me as a men's self-leadership coach, the 3E method, and I want to give you some detail behind this. So while everything up to this point was just a bit of a generic introduction, and then also looking at some of the things that often get missed, I want to now just try and give you the beginnings of a roadmap for your own personal development, for your own personal transformation. So the 3E method is those three beautiful E's: explore, energize, and empower. I've then split that up into 6 steps, two of which sit in explore, two of which sit in energize, and two of which sit in empower. So in terms of exploring, what is a way I can start to gain a greater self-awareness of who I am right now, of what my conditioning is? Well, it's by focusing on my habits and my emotions. For me, dealing with those two, spending time on those two, can be a doorway to transformational change. So it begins there. And when I talk about building healthy habits, again, I'm not just talking about going to the gym, eating better, sleeping better, less social media time. All of that's great stuff. And that is part of building healthy habits. But building healthy habits is also looking at, what are the habits that you don't tell anyone about and barely acknowledge yourself? I'm talking about things like, do you watch porn? Do you do drugs? Do you binge watch TV and watch that extra 2 episodes because you can't switch off? What are the habits that, when you feel pressure and stress, you go to more readily? I think for a lot of men, porn is used not for arousal, but it's used as a way of deflecting from what is going on inside. Oh, I'm feeling something uncomfortable. I've got a difficult challenge. I'm going to use porn or my arousal, my sex, to numb out from that and create a distraction. And it can be the same with, actually having sex with someone. It can be the same with why we choose drugs or drink, why we binge eat, why we binge watch TV. All of that is the murky stuff of the habits that we have about ourselves that I want to normalize, because we all have them to greater or lesser degrees. Maybe you're a gossip, that can be one of these shadow habits. Maybe you are sarcastic in nature and make people feel bad because it makes you feel better. These are all parts of your habits. And then when I say befriending emotions, what I'm really saying here is, what are the things that activate you? Common phrases trigger you. What happens? And how does that make you behave? And very often, the space between trigger, activation, and behavior it's like that. There's no time to reflect. It's not a response. It's not a choice. It's a reaction. So where are your reactions in life? When do you snap? When do you bite back? And these two things are very closely related. But there's ways of being able to break down your emotional trigger responses, your activations, to better understand what that's actually doing inside you, so that you can start to amend and change your behaviors over time. The energizer part is, okay, I've noticed my patterns. I'm noticing my triggers. I'm facing the habits that I'm feeling a bit of shame about. I'm recognizing that some of my parts that are jumping in. Then there's a couple of things that I want to focus on. The first is I call it sensitive discernment. What I mean by that is your empathy, your awareness emotionally and sensitively of those around you. And how do you fully feel and connect to other people and those around you without overwhelm? How do you do it without self-abandoning? How do you show empathy without overgiving? How do you give kindness and empathy to those that really deserve it and those that are showing you the opposite of that, who don't deserve it? Do you fawn them? Do you people please them? And if so, let's get into that. And I think that really creating change through different choices, learning how to say no is a really simple example of that, is massive. And alongside that, in an energetic way, is what does confidence mean? Very often, people can be, on the one hand, great leaders. They can sit in front of people, but it's one of these parts. It's a version of themselves that isn't authentic, that actually is driven by a version of yourselves that you feel is going to be acceptable. So leadership then becomes it becomes like a script that you're playing out rather than being authentic. And I think people can often feel that, you know. So this is about authenticity. It's starting to think, how can I tune into what's really natural for me? So how can I be vulnerable and courageous alongside building confidence? You know, how can I laugh when I make a mistake rather than feel embarrassed or humiliated? How can I, as I've already touched upon, be kind and supportive and loving to those that deserve it, that are around me, but also protect myself and those around me with appropriate boundaries? And then empower is really about revisiting gifts and purpose. Now, when I say things like, what are your gifts? What are your purpose? You might go blank, and that's okay. But gifts really are often the things that we abandon, that sit in our beneath the behaviors of the parts of us. So, a good one for me that I touched upon in my story is I abandoned all the creative parts of me in favor of football because of the reactions that I had as a child. So for me, redeveloping my relationship with my creativity, loving singing, loving being able to read books, loving being able to play games, to dance, to laugh, to not worry about looking uncool, for example. For me, these are all ways of exploring gifts and trying new things, not because you think that you could, build a career out of it, but because it brings you joy. And anything that brings us joy is ultimately purpose driven. It's part of who we are. So opening ourselves up to doing some of the things that we feel too shy or too afraid of doing can positively build on all of the explore and energize areas of our life, and expand that nervous system and build that confidence, And sometimes it can lead to quite profound transformational changes. Like, the reason I'm doing this right now is because of the personal work I did. It just became apparent to me that actually this is something that's always been inside me. Even when I was struggling, I had the skills to be able to be empathetic naturally, to be able to listen, to be able to hold space, to encourage, to notice patterns and reflect them back and to ask questions. That's what being a coach is, which is why I'm not sitting here in front of you as some kind of guru. That's not who I'm looking to be either. That's not part of it. For me, my passion is helping you become who you're here to be. My passion is doing that because that is me becoming who I'm here to be. And all of that, when we're consciously paying attention to it and taking action, that for me is self-leadership success. And I guarantee that if you embrace all of these different things in ways that are meaningful to you, you will then be able to pause at different points and look back and say, wow, this has really changed. I am now able to sit with my emotions when they're difficult and, not numb out in some way. I am able to make the choices that are going to serve me and those around me most of the time. And when I notice myself not doing that, I can be kind and compassionate and make the switch. Yes, I still get activated and I still get triggered, but it doesn't automatically lead to that behavior, that snapping, that shouting, that whatever those behaviors are that don't help you or those around you. I can sit with it. I can notice that's happening. I might even vocalize that, but then I can check in on myself and choose to respond rather than react. I now am an incredibly loving and supportive person, especially to those that are important to me and to those that deserve it and to those that I am working with, but not to the point where I self abandon and overgive and overwork so I can't be present at home. Not so that I say yes to everything that my partner wants and never really speak my mind. Like, none of that is empathetic. That's people pleasing, which is harmful and toxic, potentially. And then similarly, you're able to be yourself and people notice that energy. They notice that frequency that you're in and they respond to that. You're confident because you're at ease with who you are, not because you're playing a role of someone that's confident. They're two completely different things. You are exploring all of your hobbies, your gifts. You are unashamedly doing things that bring you joy and not worried about what people think. All of that and more for me is self-leadership success. Then lastly, look, thank you for being here. I'm not going to go through all of these different slides, but take a moment to pause and read through them. There's lots of different ways of working with me. A big part of me doing this is that I recognize that things are economically different for so many, difficult for so many people. They have been for me over the past 5 years, trust me. But at the same time, I believe that transformation to the length that we're talking about here has a value to it, which is why at the one end, working with me in depth has that value to it. But at the same time, just being here hasn't cost you anything financially. And to start the journey with me, it can be done in a way that is one step at a time. But if you are feeling called to work with me, just start by connecting. Like, you can book in that exploration call, which becomes an investment for whatever you might do next. And if you never do anything next, you're still going to leave that call with clarity. Okay. But most of all, thank you for being here. I hope you've taken something out of it. And if you haven't already done so, please do connect with me. I'm on all of these socials, Nick Edgar Coaching, and connect with the 3E Space too, because you can also see some of the work that Jess does, my partner. And if you do have any questions, please don't be a stranger. However small, just ask them. I'm really keen to develop relationships with men, whether you choose to work with me or not. I think we're all better off when we lift each other up. So that's it. Thank you so much for being here. And wherever you're at as a man right now, whatever you think is possible for you, I hope that you've been able to take something away from today. And I hope you feel enthused to keep moving forwards, to keep growing, to keep evolving and being the best man that you can be for you and for those around you. Till the next time, take care.